Thank you very much, Emma. As those who have been to CA conferences know, there is really only one role for the CA president, and that's to fill the gap between the AGM and the dinner. So my title was, as it were, chosen for me by my role. It's one of the joys of learning an inflected language that one can play endless games of filling the gaps. There's not much educational value in completing the sentence, "The pretty girl loves a fool blank man." But there are lessons in Latin word order, as well as in how to decline Latin, in filling in stult blank puella formos ramat. Or are there? Doesn't it depend which chapter of the textbook one is reading? Might the lesson not rather be about intransitive verbs and/or the formation of adverbs? Filling in the gaps turns out to demand more knowledge than we might initially expect. We need to know the context if we're to fill in the writing. Amat qui scrua blank might potentially be completed in a number of different ways. But when one knows this is a Pompeian wall, there's little temptation to complete this with anything other than the verb scribit. Not only is this the most common verb beginning with scra, the self-referentiality gives the graffito an obvious point that completions involving scrutor, or come to that, screo, if Plautus can use it, why not a graffiti artist? That such completions would lack. The hypothesis is further strengthened in this case by the fact that, as well as being found in this incomplete form on House 1 in Insula 10 and Regio 1 in Pompeii, the same words are found complete elsewhere at Pompeii on the House of Balbus, where it forms part of an obscene scenario. Except that there, as you can see from the apparatus, even if you can't decipher the way in which inscriptions are published, you can see from the apparatus that the text reads scribet, a common Pompeian variant, common enough for us to wonder whether perhaps that wasn't what was written in Insula 10 too. Filling the gaps is one of the most time-honoured pursuits of classical scholarship. It's the first inscription in Meggs and Lewis with a lovely gap in its first line. The record that comes down to us from antiquity has so suffered from the ravages of time that gaps abound. It's part of the romance of the subject and of the stories so well told by Leighton Reynolds and Nigel Wilson in Scribes and Scholars that much of what we do have came so close to perishing completely, and that the hard work of scholars has brought back a world so nearly lost. For Reynolds and Wilson, page 207 in the third edition, reversing the process of loss is the business of textual criticism. What I want to demonstrate in this lecture is that the gaps are too many, too various, and filling them far too complex to be left to textual critics. It's the business of us all. Sometimes filling the gap is no problem at all. Even if we didn't have the statue of the dying Gaul, which this broken cast in Edinburgh copies, it's hard to think that there would be much dispute about how to reconstruct this arm. But, as Mark Wallinger saw when he chose to borrow this cast for his Hayward Gallery exhibition, The Russian Linesman, in 2009, the gap here draws attention to, rather than away from, the weight of the body and the sculptural expression of pain and exhaustion of a man close to collapse. Even when our restorations are beyond dispute, the very act of restoration may diminish rather than enhance our appreciation of some qualities of the original. It's a problem for this reason that many gaps have been filled so long ago that we no longer think of them as gaps at all. So familiar are we with the scholarly restoration that stands for the lost original. We can learn quite a lot about gaps from Laocoon's arm. When the group was found in January 1506, the right arm of Laocoon and the right hands of the two sons were missing. Early copies and prints show some dispute over how the arm should be restored. But for several centuries, the figure of Laocoon was restored to thrust a right arm, initially of terracotta and then of stucco, into the air. Then, in 1942, the vertical arm, near vertical arm, was replaced by a bent arm, as an antique arm without a hand that had been found in 1906 was substituted for that stucco arm. That the position of the arm affects the impression given by the statue group as a whole cannot be disputed. As long as Laocoon can continue to stretch out his arm, his human strength is advertised. Whatever happens to this man, he insists to the end that he's a man of strength, able to break free of the block. But once the arm is bent double, the agony of the expression is doubled also. This man is constrained, broken. Whatever his mind intends, his body signals his defeat. The effect of the bent arm is, in this case, much more powerful than the effect of having no arm at all. The earliest pictures of the Laocoon from the 16th century, and the earliest of all dates from between 1506 and 1508, immediately after its excavation, show the group without the arm restored. Because we're used to seeing a right arm, we immediately notice the absence. But the non-existent arm does not cry out as the bent arm does. Our attention is drawn rather to the way the chest is thrust out and the head thrust back. This Laocoon looks metaphorically and literally taken aback, with shock more powerful and resentment, anger and defiance less strongly emphasized. His shock more palpable than his struggle. It's not news, of course, that different restorations have different effects in art, just as in texts. We know that. What we want to know is which of these effects was emphasized by the piece in its original form in antiquity. Our first recourse here is to other ancient representations. The two Greek vases on which Laocoon is shown have nothing in common with this composition and are of no help. Not even worth showing. Most promising are two representations in Pompeian wall painting in the house of Menander and the house of Laocoon, though the second of these, which seems iconographically the closest, is badly damaged so as to cut off precisely that right arm. There's a rule about this, isn't there? In the house of Menander, however, Laocoon is luckier, raising his right arm to brandish a snake. And in the later Vatican Virgil depiction, the arms are again raised. Is this enough to justify the old restoration? Well, hardly, I think, for both of these representations take advantage of their painted medium to draw attention to the bigger narrative context, and in particular to the religious context, most obviously signalled here, as the sculptural group does not. As soon as that religious context is stressed, communication with the gods becomes important as communication with the viewer. And when communication with the gods is important, upraised arms acquire a religious implication. If we're going to have any confidence about how we fill the gap caused by the loss of Laocoon's arm, we need to seek help from works that are in the same genre as the Laocoon. The best parallels are arguably to be drawn from other self-contained sculptural groups. And above all, with the sculptures reconstructed from the thousands of fragments in the Italian sea cave at Sperlonga. Because the Polyphemus group at Sperlonga carries the signatures of the three Rhodian artists to whom the elder Pliny ascribes a Laocoon group in Titus's palace at Rome, a group that's always been identified with the surviving sculpture, comparison between it and the Laocoon is regular. But it's not less pertinent for being regular. The poses of Odysseus' companions here, and particularly the one carrying the wineskin on the right-hand side. Where is he? No. Yes, there we are. There is your wineskin. He's the guy I'm interested in. Offering a close parallel to those of Laocoon's sons. But do they help with Laocoon's arm? Polyphemus's inebriated languor might be reckoned completely beyond comparison with Laocoon's adrenaline-fueled frenzy. But our question is not about finding the same pose, but about understanding how these sculptors related their figures, how they made these figures speak when they were separated from their wider narrative context. Polyphemus's drunkenness is actually very useful here. It guarantees that the viewer's attention is not on how Polyphemus is already reacting, but upon the action that's being done. And Odysseus' companion with the wineskin is useful too, for it's his lively engagement that signals that what's at issue is not simply the execution of a cunning plot by the intrepid leader, whose conic hat crowns the pyramidal composition, but the possibility that these still youthful men, how they can come to be so youthful after a decade at Troy and endless voyaging is something of a wonder, will survive to carry on the civilized life in which wine is not abused. If Polyphemus is not permanently disabled, these men will have drunk their last wine. The force of the sculpture is concentrated on the moment when the story might have turned out differently, when Polyphemus might have awoken, or simply turned in his sleep, and thwarted the whole plan. And the gesture that concentrates the viewer's attention, will they succeed or not, is the arm of the wineskin carrier. And Laocoon? Once one's seen the role of Odysseus' wineskin carrier for the Polyphemus group, one cannot escape seeing how vital the elder son is to the Laocoon group. The elder son's gaze, his arm, notwithstanding the missing hand, the pressure he exerts with his left hand upon the snake's tail, as if he's removing a tight boot, all of these set up the viewers to slide their gaze up to the father with a question in mind. That question's not Virgil's question about pain and the justice of the gods. It's a question about what will happen. Will so tough a guy as Laocoon really succumb? Can an alternative scenario be written? Could Laocoon and his children escape? The snake may have got the soft flesh of the younger son firmly within its grip, both arms immobilized. But can it really do the same for this wrestler of a father? What we think will happen next is crucially affected by what we hear Laocoon uttering. Nigel Spivey, in a chapter of his Enduring Creation, to which he gave the deliberately misleading title, The Audition of Laocoon's Scream, writes that, I quote, the noise implicit from Laocoon's straining features doesn't really matter. Groan, scream, or sigh. That can't be right. What we imagine hearing matters a lot. In fact, it determines our reading of the whole group. Winckelmann had to rule out a heaven-rending scream, and here rather an anxious, heavy-burdened sigh, in order to insist that this group fills us with misery. But the noise that comes out of Laocoon's mouth is in turn affected by the position of his arm. The more bent the arm, the more stifled the cry. I observed too that the noise that comes out of Laocoon's mouth is affected as well by whether or not he's made to wear a fig leaf. The fig leaf adds a constraint that Laocoon can do without. This has got to be a naked man who is struggling, not a man worried about his manhood. It's not by chance that Laocoon's penis is the centre and axis of the composition. What's suggested by the parallel with the Polyphemus group from Sperlonger, and indeed with other Hellenistic sculpture such as the Barberini faun, is that the arm needs to be put back into a position which says as little as possible about what will happen from this point on. We need to be able to entertain the possibility that Laocoon and his sons may escape if we're to become absorbed in this as struggle, rather than becoming spectators, refusing to embrace the sadistic pleasures of seeing disobedience punished. There's no doubt that the current arm is too sharply bent, in my view. Arguably, the traditional restoration wasn't bent enough, and the younger son's arm in particular was over-demonstrative. Here, as elsewhere, filling the gaps demands understanding what was happening in antiquity. As with my argument about Laocoon's arm, the most obvious way to do that is to look for parallels. But what counts as a parallel may not be straightforward. I've just tried to show you that representations of Laocoon in other media may prove less of a parallel than contemporary sculpture on other subjects. And parallels can themselves never determine how a gap must be filled. They just constitute one argument. But in the course of arguing, we learn something. That's why we have discussion after papers. One of the nicest examples of how even parallels have their limits comes from an Athenian inscription, recording the regulations adopted by 3 of the cities of Chaea and Cyclades at Athenian insistence about the export of Chaean ruddle, miltos, it's a red clay. Here we have the fragmentary remains of a text formulated at a single moment, laying down the rules that 3 cities had adopted after being visited by Athenian officials. We might expect the rules to be identical so that we can fill the gaps in one from what's preserved in the other. But they're not. The cities chose to present items in a different order, to add or omit qualifications, and to involve different officials. For epigraphers trying to restore the text, this is extremely frustrating. But what leaves one gap fills another. For the very variation involved here tells us something about Athenian imperialism in the 4th century and something about her allies' reactions to it. The Athenian insistence that Chaean ruddle be exported only to Athens, and only in ships approved by the Athenians for the purpose, is one that's puzzled modern scholars, and has seemed an extremely heavy-handed piece of intervention. Those keen to limit state economic intervention to food and military necessities recognising that one cannot eat ruddle, have had to insist that it was used to keep triremes watertight. A desperate solution, and not only because pitch did the job better. But if the irregularity of the text does nothing to help us understand why the Athenians intervened, that irregularity does tell us a lot about Athenian imperialism. Athens was not imposing boilerplate legal texts on the cities of Chaea in the way that she had imposed boilerplate texts of the Standards Decree, otherwise known as the Coinage Decree, on her allies during the 420s. Rather, she was sending ambassadors to make the case for monopoly and leaving it, at least broadly, to the separate cities of Chaea to put Athenian desires into law as best they could. But as the gap in our understanding of Athenian imperialism closes, the gap in our understanding of the ancient economy opens up. If these Chaean cities were persuaded to do this, rather than forced to adopt a particular text, the implication is that they could see some valid reason, we presume an economic reason, for why the Athenians might demand the monopoly. But we still can't see what. How we fill a gap often depends on where we reckon ourselves to be most confident. Nice case of this is given by an Athenian deme decree, probably from the small deme of Hagnous, near modern Markopoula, just southeast of Athens Airport. After laying down regulations for examining deme magistrates at the end of their office, the decree sets out how the festival of the Plerossia is to be celebrated. On a date specified but lost, that's 7 letters long, and the bit of text that you need to look at is here. This is the edge of the preserved stone. The text went on out here. We've got 3 letters, and then we've got spaces along here. Here is the 19th century text with dots for what you need to fill in. And the end of the word is here, at the beginning of the next line. So on this specified but lost date, the demarch is to sacrifice the Plerossia to Zeus at a cost of 500 drachmas, and he's to distribute the meat on the 7th to those present, and to those at the meeting, and to those offering to secure loans. How do we fill in the date that is lost? This might seem to be a simple matter. This is a Stoicheidon inscription, so we know exactly how long the date has got to be. And there are not many dates that fit the available letter spaces. But that leaves us with an awkward choice. 2 dates are possible, the 5th and the 7th of the month. We wouldn't expect the same date to be mentioned twice in the same sentence, so we should exclude the 7th. But, particularly given other sacrificial regulations which stipulate that the meat's to be consumed on the spot, we would also not expect the meat from the sacrifice to be kept for 2 days before distribution. So we should exclude the 5th. Do we relax our assumptions about how carefully this deme formulated its decisions? This is an inscription notably carelessly inscribed. But scribal error will not account for this redundancy of expression. And the phrasing of this text is otherwise economical. Or do we relax our assumptions about how long meat might be left hanging about in a sanctuary? Hanging beef to intensify the flavour is a practice familiar in Northern Europe, of course, but that's in cool or refrigerated conditions. Hanging beef or any other meat in the Mediterranean, even in what was perhaps September, is something of a different matter. And a lot of meat is at issue here. 500 drachmas should buy 5 to 7 cattle, yielding up to 700 kilos of meat. somewhere around 2 kilos of meat per household in this deme. The truth is, we know rather little about consumption of meat in classical Athens, and although in general there seems in antiquity to be, as one would expect, a very close connection between the slaughterhouse and the butcher's shop, implying the expectation that meat would have been newly killed, less immediate consumption cannot be entirely ruled out. In one sense, what I've just uncovered is merely an antiquarian gap. As with many other areas of ancient life, it's day-to-day aspects which were taken for granted, about which we know least. But reconstructing the everyday is not a trivial matter. If consumption of meat sacrificed at a festival could be spread over several days, then the act of killing the animal becomes separated from the act of consuming it, and the significance of instructions to consume on the spot, or of permission to take away, becomes quite different. If delayed consumption was in any way normal, then the debate between Walter Burkert and Jean-Pierre Vernon over whether the significance of sacrifice should be located in the act of killing or in the act of dividing up the animal would be significantly weighted in favour of Burkert and killing. But the festival too becomes a very different event if the concluding merry party is an optional extra, not an invariant feature. Rather than side either with those who think that sacrifices were moments of guilt and remorse, or those who think that they were moments of festivity and celebration, we might have to contemplate a world in which the same act of sacrifice was, in different cases, differently freighted, that some festivals were indeed occasions of some solemnity, terminated without a meat meal. The alternative way of filling this gap, simply reading the same date twice in the same sentence, might seem rather less consequential. Just another bit of bad phrasing in an official document. Hardly news there. Given the importance of understanding epigraphic language for recreating the text on damaged stones, it's remarkable how little work has been done on the language of inscriptions, even of Athenian inscriptions. But although the organisation and sequence of thoughts in classical Athenian inscriptions is often somewhat chaotic, that seems almost always best explained by their more or less directly transcribing what someone had said. And repetition of the sort we would be dealing with in the Hagnus document isn't characteristic of speech. For all its orthographic mistakes, this decree is actually rather carefully drafted. The sentence immediately before the one in question does repeat the phrase, God of whom he is a priest, but it finds two distinct ways of doing so. The sentence with the date makes good rhetorical sense. It even has some chiastic elegance. If the dates are different, on the 5th, let the demarch sacrifice, and let him distribute the meat on the 7th. Just as with Laocoon, we need in the end to trust our aesthetic sensibilities, so here we should allow our literary sensibilities to overrule our squeamishness about meat storage. But aesthetic and literary sensibilities are often not much help in filling even epigraphic gaps. Take my last epigraphic example, the much discussed decrees about the priestess of Athena Nike. Most modern scholars concern the earlier of the two decrees, Meg's Lewis 44, which you have on the screen, because it's undated and its date has been held to be crucial for our understanding of the Acropolis building programme. But the later text, Meg's Lewis 71, on the back of the stele, which is dated with some confidence to 424-3, has a very curious gap. So you can see it most clearly here. This is the gap I'm interested in. You can see it here. This is a gap which doesn't matter at all for our understanding of the sense of the decree, but it reveals how little we understand of the inscribing of Athenian decrees. The issue is that the decree starts in Attic letters. If you look at the first line of the decree, actually let me give you a bigger picture. If you look in the first line here, you'll see nice examples of the use of epsilon for eta, the use of omicron for omicron upsilon in boule, and of omicron for omega. If you then look at the sort of third line from the bottom, you'll see an omega, and in the second line from the bottom, you'll see a number of etas. So it's that change in alphabet that I'm interested in. So the decree starts in Attic letters. It has a usual introductory formula. And just before the gap, it's begun with the words, "To the priestess of Athena Nike." Then there is this one-letter break in the text where something's been erased before the text goes on. To the priestess of Athena Nike, "The 50 drachmas decreed on the stele are to be given by the Colocratae." There's no break in sense, just the one-letter gap, and a change not just of hand but of script from Attic to Ionic letters. Alphabetic change was not a trivial matter. This is clear not simply from its being the subject of an official decree, when Archinus persuaded the Athenians to adopt Ionic as their official alphabet in 403-2, 21 years after this, but also from the way in which, around the time of the oligarchic coup of 411, Attic script had been used in democratic documents, Ionic script in oligarchic. Armand Dangour, in an article in 1999, suggested that, I quote, "the kind of education that would have ensured a thoroughgoing familiarity with Ionic letters remained the preserve of the privileged few." So what on earth happened during the inscribing of this decree that made them change not just scribe, but script, and change a record that concerned a conspicuously democratic priesthood, she was chosen by lot from all Athenians, into cosmopolitan Ionic letters? The literal gap in the Athena Nike inscription doesn't actually need to be filled. The sense is complete without our putting anything into the gap. Indeed, the gap was deliberately left. But what the literal gap does is draw attention to a gap in our knowledge, to what we don't know about the politics of even the best documented Greek city in its best documented period. This shouldn't surprise us, not because we should be used to the fact that we have so tenuous a grip on antiquity, but because we should be aware that everyone has a tenuous grip even on the present, let alone the past. It's not because information once recorded has been lost that we find it difficult to understand what goes on in the Athena Nike inscription. The loss of a word in the Hagnus inscription only highlights our ignorance of sacrifice and meat eating. It doesn't create that ignorance. Our ignorance stems from the fact that no one in antiquity was concerned to write about these things. So too, the loss of Laocoon's arm serves only to draw attention to our inability to put ourselves back into the shoes of the artist. Traditional history, like much popular history today, was keen to write the story of the past through thoughts attributed to protagonists. This is an example more or less at random. Historians pretended that they knew the motivations of various actors. Academic history today eschews such mind reading. But to do so is disingenuous. It may be historically unimportant to read the minds of the Rhodian sculptors responsible for the Laocoon, but it's historically vital to be able to read the minds of the Greeks and Romans who saw the sculpture in antiquity. Reading their minds doesn't depend upon the quantity of information we have about them. It depends upon making the right observations. Observations triggered by questions, and the gaps in our record raise questions and aid observation. Classics owes a lot to its gaps. It's true that when Malcolm Schofield and his team wrote the benchmarking statement for classics about the attributes of a typical classics graduate, they didn't flag up the ability to fill gaps. But the ability to detect and fill gaps is nonetheless absolutely prime among the skills we teach classics undergraduates. If we were not conscious of the gaps that we face, we might be inclined to ignore the questions. That gap in the Athena Nike inscription points us to the way in which how Athenians wrote was a political matter. Our consciousness of the need to fill gaps alerts us to the interactions between the subdisciplines within classics that elsewhere in the academy are blithely ignored. Modern historians, for example, go on thinking that they can write political history without also writing social and economic history. But how can you? Take UK politics today. If we want to understand what government does and doesn't do, we need to know not simply about the ideological slant of those in power, we need to know who lives where. We can probably all have a stab at how our place of residence affects our own political attitudes and capacities. But we probably none of us could begin to write an analysis of the country as a whole. That's partly because we don't have at our fingertips the data that could be gathered. But it is partly that even if we had all the census data that we think we might need, we wouldn't know what lived reality that corresponded to. But once we've asked those questions and worried about the way that accessible data might address them, we won't quite see UK politics the same again. There's a good reason why politicians don't talk much about patterns of poverty and deprivation and how they map onto who lives where and votes for what. Who lived where in classical Attica mattered. I first got myself known as an ancient historian with the observation that Finlay's claim that to understand Athens meant understanding that Athens was a face-to-face society made no sense. 30 to 50,000 citizens and a total population of upwards of 200,000, even in the 4th century, distributed across 2,500 square kilometres, hardly a face-to-face society. Face-to-face encounters certainly changed the way people interact. That's why the CA conference is such a central part of academic life for the subject. But that Athenians met in various small groups didn't make Athens itself a face-to-face society. In most ways, our knowledge of who lived where in classical Attica hasn't changed much since I worried about it in the early 1980s. It isn't just that we can't replicate the sort of information a census would give. We can't even trace the material remains of where Athenians lived. Athens' urban expansion and the expansion of weekend homes outside the city over the Attic countryside means that Attica is not a place where one can do the intensive archaeological survey that elsewhere in ancient Greece has transformed our understanding of settlement. The question of whether Athenians who lived outside Athens and the Piraeus primarily lived in villages or in isolated farms is not one to which the archaeology provides a definitive answer, any more than it did when I started work. But even though we have no new data, our understanding of the population of Athens has indeed changed. Traditional debates over exactly how many citizens there were in Athens didn't relate that number to the settlement pattern of Attica. But as soon as we asked the question, we realised we don't need to be able to discover the actual answer to who lived where in order to discover the parameters with which an answer must fall. Athens, at her most populous, immediately before the plague in the 5th century, plausibly had a total population, men, women, children, metic slaves, of somewhere around 360,000, which gives a population density of 150 persons per square kilometre. Here are some answers to the questions you were puzzling about earlier. Such a density is modest by the standards of modern England, 395 per square kilometre, but not by the standards of modern Wales, 141 per square kilometre, let alone modern Europe, 117 per square kilometre. Is vastly in excess of the population density of 19th century Boeotia, 17 per square kilometre, and greatly in excess of what was yesterday in a paper described as densely populated 4th century BC Boeotia, merely 83 per square kilometre. Even if one allows that a third of the total population of Attica was in the town of Athens, that leaves 100 persons per square kilometre for the rest of Attica. If one splits those into family farm units with 6 2/3 people per farm, then there would be 15 farms per square kilometre, one farm for every 6.66 hectares. And if we imagine those 6 2/3 hectare plots as squares, they'd have sides of just over 257 metres. If each farm were in the middle of each plot, the farms would be 250 metres apart. Not much of a gap there. Even less if one distributes the population over only the cultivable parts of Attica, about 40% of the whole. So the paradox is that in order for there to be any farms that one could call isolated, the settlement pattern must have been dominated by villages. The distribution of Athenians across the Attic landscape impacted upon Athenian politics. Claire Taylor's work has shown that those officers selected by lot come disproportionately from demes in and around Athens itself and from demes elsewhere in Attica, whereas officers selected by election, above all but not only the strategoi, and even more candidates for that sort of reverse election, ostracism, come disproportionately from the area of Athens itself and the surrounding plain of Athens. This pattern reinforces other evidence in showing that most Athenians, including the rich, stayed rooted in their demes. It was the demes, the villages, not Athens as a whole, that formed face-to-face societies. But this pattern also suggests that it was those from in and near Athens who came to be known outside those face-to-face groups, presumably because they were present at a higher proportion of tribal and city events. It was those who could walk to Athens who would regularly be seen at central events. By contrast, if there was a donkey park beside the Pnyx whenever the assembly met, it'd be different people's donkeys on each occasion. While there's plenty of evidence, above all from the title of Athenian comedies, not just Acharnians, but Eupolis' Prospaltioi, his Demoi, and so on, that Athenians realised that the men from different demes behaved differently. But no one in antiquity remarked on the town-centred bias of elections. The gap we're filling here is a gap in ancient perceptions, not just in modern knowledge. Whether any Athenians perceived the pattern and decided not to comment on it for fear of reviving the consciousness of regional politics that had once dogged archaic Attica, we can't tell. The gap in time has made it possible for us to investigate this pattern of deprivation and over-representation without fearing unintended political consequences. And it reinforces the case for us to ask similar questions about our own society. Heightening one's awareness of gaps in one's own knowledge and discourse lies at the core of academic work across the arts and humanities. Political and sociological theory, Marx and Bourdieu, observations about human societies close to or far from our own, Sarah Katsani or the Trobriand Islanders, are quite as capable of revealing what we don't know about ourselves or daren't ask as our studies of classical antiquity. So too, the construction of the world by Manet or Picasso or James Joyce or Derek Walcott repay our study with as rich perceptions of the problems and possibilities of visual or verbal communication as do Simonides or Simonides. Nor is Karl Barth necessarily a worse guide for thinking about God than Hesiod. But classicists nevertheless have great advantages. The advantages of the study of ancient Greece and Rome for perceiving the gaps in our own understanding of ourselves come from the manageable scale of the Greek and Roman worlds. We can reasonably expect to acquaint ourselves during a lifetime of diligent study, if not in the 3 or 4 years afforded to us as undergraduates, with a range of literary, historical, philosophical, and archaeological evidence from ancient Greece and Rome. And it comes too from the classical world's unique combination of distance and proximity. It matters that classical art stands behind Manet and Picasso, classical literature behind the modern novel, ancient history and ancient historical and philosophical debate behind Marx and Bourdieu. Whether we like it or not, the always already starts with the Greeks, not in Mesopotamia or in Egypt. Those keen to substitute ancient world studies for classics are foolish to ignore that, in my view. When we're perceiving gaps in the classical world, we're perceiving gaps in a world which has crucially structured our own. Even Christian theology wouldn't take the shape it does were it not for the ways in which the supernatural had been discussed in Greece and Rome. Just as the life of the historical Jesus was shaped by Roman power, so Christianity was crucially shaped by imperial cult. But the need to fill the gaps, if we're to understand the Greek and Roman world, also puts the classicist in a peculiar position. Anthropologists have traditionally been committed to spending sufficient time in the field that there are no gaps. They come to convince themselves that they can not merely eat like the Sarah Katsani, but can think like them, can reproduce them. And the great advantage of theory is that it offers a complete explanation, at least of the aspect of life that it claims to model. By contrast, classicists know that there are gaps. We know not merely that we don't know the answers to all the questions we want to ask, but that we don't know what evidence to trust and what to discard. We know that we're exploring a world of representations where, like us, our ancient informants are creating a story out of their very partial perceptions. This familiarity with a world of gaps and with the imaginative techniques required to fill them gives us both an opportunity and an obligation. And I conclude with one final gap, a gap of a different sort, a gap between art and text, but also between text and life. Perhaps the most quoted single sentence about women in Athens is Apollodorus's claim in the Neaira speech that hetairae we have for the sake of pleasure, palakai for day-to-day care of the body, and wives for the production of legitimate children and the security of household goods. Somehow the security of household goods doesn't often figure in discussions of this sentence. As has long been recognised, and I quote Chris Carey, Apollodorus is not offering a legal definition of these three categories. Imagine the fun orators would have had these been the terms of the law. I quote again, it's a purely rhetorical distinction, which has no meaning in terms of existing institutions. It's Vernon in Myth and Society, indicating, I go on with a Vernon quote, the desire to establish a clear demarcation and at the same time the impossibility of doing so. Vernon's concern here, what he wants to demarcate, is marriage. His concern is with marriage and the difficulty of defining what constituted valid marriages in Athens. And Vernon's suggestion that there might be problems identifying a wife get obvious textual support. Notoriously, there is no single word for a wife in classical Athens. The word Apollodorus uses here is guner, woman. By contrast, language might suggest that prostitutes are easily distinguished. Apollodorus has two different prostitute terms, and he's been liberal in his speech with a third, porner. But the total inadequacy of Apollodorus's definitions of the hetaira and the palaker here alert us to a serious issue. Modern commentators worry about the implication that wives didn't provide pleasure, and we might worry even more about the implication that they didn't provide care, therapeia, for their husband. But why does Apollodorus not insist on the presence of exchange of money as the characteristic of the hetaira? Exchange of money has been seen by modern scholars as absolutely crucial to recognizing hetairai in images. The long debate about whether the bags which both young and older men offer to women in a series of pots, whether those bags contain money or something else, with knuckle bones as the favoured answer, is motivated by the thought that if these bags contain money, then the recipients must be prostitutes, as if these pots showed scenes of life. The mismatch between text and image here, with the image blatantly showing what the text avoids, should make us ask not simply about the gap between text and image, but about the gap between both visual and verbal images and Athenian life. Yet scholars have been remarkably inclined to assume that there is no such gap between the images and life. The collective volume, edited by a team of distinguished scholars working in the USA, led by Elaine Fantham, Women in the Classical World, Image and Text, tells us, page 116, that the lives of Athenian prostitutes, both at work in the company of male clients and at home among themselves, are best documented by hundreds of red figure vase paintings from the late 6th century to the late 5th. Even more universally, Apollodorus' claim that Neaira was a prostitute have been left unquestioned. I quote Chris Carey, "This speech provides our most detailed account of the life of a prostitute in ancient Greece." Odd that he didn't reckon it the most detailed account of the life of a wife. While Deborah Hamill, in his book Trying Neaira, is subtitled "The True Story of a Courtesan's Scandalous Life in Ancient Greece." Fantasies about a world in which any woman will sell sex for money, like those on these pots, or in which sexual pleasure and legitimate children don't mix, as Apollodorus maintains, are easily constructed, whether by words or by images. But neither world corresponds to the world of experience. Texts and images alike seek to persuade those who consume them to see the world in a particular way. Some forms of argument work better in text. It's hard enough to show pleasure, let alone legitimacy, on a red figure pot. Others work better in images. Texts find it harder to keep money and knuckle bones hidden. Noting the gap between art and text in ancient Greek culture is not merely an academic tease. It's our first step towards coming to understand the forces shaping the lives of women, and not only of ancient women. James Davidson, who led off the third chapter of Courtesans and Fish Cakes with that passage of Apollodorus, complained that since Vernon, scholars had reinstated the clear divide between wives and prostitutes, but had treated all prostitutes as essentially the same. And he himself proceeded to stress the varieties of prostitute. But if prostitutes were not all the same, nor were wives. The conditions of wives were not made uniform by their all being in a position to bear legitimate children, any more than prostitutes were in the same position because they could all give pleasure, or because they all exchanged sex for material goods. As Neaera's story shows, whether she was a prostitute or a wife, and what sort of a prostitute or a wife she was not simply a matter of the different objective conditions that she enjoyed at different parts of her life. It was a matter of what those who talked about her could persuade others. From that point of view, Vernon was wrong to claim that Apollodorus was making, I quote, a purely rhetorical distinction which has no meaning in terms of the existing institutions. It was precisely rhetorical constructions like those of Apollodorus that constituted institutions such as they were. And what one could or could not get away with rhetorically depended as much on overall context as on objective behaviour, as it does today. For all their familiarity with gaps, even classical scholars find it hard not to believe what they read, and even harder not to believe what they see. And that's as true when we read about and see images of contemporary reality as it is of images and textual descriptions of ancient reality. But by the time we see their image or read about them, whether the image is on television or in a family photo album, the description in a newspaper or a personal letter, individuals have always already been framed. And it's as true today as it was at the time of Neaera's trial that that framing is more varied and more insistent when it comes to women than when it comes to men. If we're going to continue to lay claim to the peculiar advantages of a classical education, and I have no doubt that we should, then we should lay claim in particular to our skills in detecting and drawing attention to gaps, and to the difficulties of filling those gaps. But we should be using those skills and encouraging our students to use those skills, not merely to enrich our knowledge of the classical world and of the glories of its cultural products, but to mount more powerful and more insistent critiques of modern perpetration of the horrors that were Greece and Rome. And where better to start than with sexual stereotyping and the unequal treatment of women. Thank you very much.